Stories, real conversations. This is Real Talk with RAFF.
Hello, I'm Susan RAFF, and welcome to Real Talk. We took a little hiatus, a few weeks off from Real Talk, but now we are back, and it's very exciting. We have a new set, we have new chairs, and to christen the show, I've decided to invite Scott McLean, who is a political science professor at Quinnipiac University. Scott and I have worked together for many years, so thank you. It looks fabulous, doesn't it?
Nice digs.
Yeah.
Very comfortable.
I know, it's very exciting, and you don't have to clip a microphone on. I like this.
Compliments to your interior designer then.
Yes, we have. They're fabulous. So I want to welcome you to Real Talk. You and I have worked together. We went to New Hampshire together for the primary. And now here we are, and the race is so different from earlier this year.
So different.
Before we talk about the vice presidential debate, young students, and the people that you talk to and how they weigh in on the political scene, do you think that there is some voter burnout? Do you think, I sense that from people that we've been talking about this election for such a long time, that people want to be engaged, it's very important, but they're a little bit overwhelmed.
Well, we know that people are getting exhausted with the whole polarized nation idea. And it's not just that people disagree, but a significant percentage of people, including young people, just are finding it exhausting. And so I think that part of the reason for that is that it begins to percolate and permeate into everything. You can't drink a Bud Light anymore without making a political statement. You can't listen to Taylor Swift without it having some deeper meaning about an issue. You can't go to Chick-fil-A without considering the ramifications of these things. And I think it becomes wearing over time. Also, our presidential campaigns are incredibly long. I mean, over a year. And other democracies don't have that same kind of prolonged campaign.
It's interesting you mentioned that because someone I was listening to talk about, Kamala Harris got into the race late, and she's had to wage, a very condensed, much shorter campaign, but it seems to be effective in some way. So should we take a look at that, and have a shorter campaign season instead of this long, drawn-out one?
Well, in an ideal world, yes, but I just don't see that really happening given the role of money in our politics, the role of media, 24-hour cable news cycles, the constant talking about politics, talk radio, everything. It's all sort of baked in right now. It would take a lot of changes to shorten up that season. But you mentioned that the Kamala Harris entry into the race. Really the best, most successful political launch that I've ever heard of or understood in history. She went in the space of a couple of weeks to raising up her poll standings, becoming sort of a media phenomenon with her laugh, her smile, the big crowds and the big audiences at her rallies, and to take a lead in the national polls. And some of the state polls. So
why do you think that is? Is it because of packaging? Is it because of good promotions?
I think her media team was astonishingly good at picking up on memes like the cat lady meme and other kinds of things. Her laughter, the whole meme of joy, which Oprah kind of picked up on and started playing up on. So there's all kinds of things like that. But I think the main reason is people just wanted someone other than Trump and Biden.
I want to stick with the young theme just for a minute because I know that Kamala Harris's campaign has done a lot to reach out on social media, get young voters. You mentioned Taylor Swift, so I'm going to go with that. Okay. How important is that in a campaign? That might have been unheard of years ago. And now for someone as popular as Taylor Swift is, and then kind of changing course somehow. But is that important? Does that really weigh in with voters, and should it?
I think most of the time newspaper endorsements or celebrity endorsements aren't going to make that much of a difference. But come on, we're talking about Taylor Swift. This is a different kind of figure. And I think it's because she has this, like, hundreds of millions of people following her and listening to what she says. And I wouldn't want to say she's idolized, but I mean, it's kind of pretty close to idolizing by a lot of young women. And young women, quite frankly, are going to make the difference in this election. There's a huge gender gap between the Democrats and the Republicans. Democrats have gigantic margins of support from women, but especially younger women. We know that in 2020, 2022, the youth vote made the difference in between victory and loss for Democrats all across the country. Joe Biden would not have been elected president if not for big supportive blocks of young voters and especially young women voting in Arizona and Georgia, where that made a huge difference. We know this. This is an important voting block, and Taylor Swift adds a significant support for the Democrats if she's on the side of Kamala Harris.
Let's talk about those young voters. So you and I were in New Hampshire for the presidential primary, and I had a chance to talk to a lot of your students at that time who were not very excited about either candidate.
Right.
They may have been leaning a little bit more Democrat, but I think that, Joe Biden's age, President Biden's age, was a big factor for a lot of young voters and a lot of voters in general. Has that changed, do you think, because of Kamala Harris now being the candidate for president?
I'll just give you one little fact. One thing that has remained the same is that when you ask voters in our Quinnipiac University polls, if you ask voters who would do a better job of managing the economy, Trump or Harris, Trump still has an advantage, but Harris is bringing it closer. If you look at all the demographic groups from the time of Joe Biden's candidacy to now, the only group that shows any kind of different opinion on that topic of the economy is younger voters between age 18 to 34. So what that means is just the enthusiasm or preference of that block is enough to basically even the score between Harris and Trump on managing the economy. And
so the
you can
answer
see
is
this
yes.
Absolutely, and it's just a long way of saying yes, but there's a reason for that. It's the enthusiasm of that group that is significantly different because Harris is in the race, and that is making things closer in all these polls that you see in all these different states.
I want to circle back to a more current event. I probably buried the lead. That's what they would say in this business. But this week, the vice presidential debate between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. It depends who you read, who you look at, the comments. Not a lot of fireworks. What was your reaction to the debate?
I think both campaigns decided as a strategy that they didn't want too much attack dog politics. Usually the vice presidential nominees of both parties, that's sort of their role. Let the top of the ticket be nice and they be the attack dogs and sort of go after each other. I think the positions are reversed, partly because the people at the top can be attack dogs. There was a lot of fireworks on the Harris-Trump debate. The Walz-Vance debate, I had to check my calendar. Are we in 2024 or is this 1985?
Is that because we're so used to fireworks and we're so used to attacks and back and forth that when it seems just diplomatic and addressing the issues, we're bored? Is that right?
Yeah, well, it isn't that the issues have to be boring, but I think it's definitely tapping into a different part of your mind. You have to start following the arguments in a more logical way rather than waiting for a zinger or an insult or a one-liner that is going to get picked up in some meme or in some soundbite somewhere and played over and over and over again. I would think it's pretty hard to find some of those kinds of zingers in that debate. that are going to have that kind of resonance and stick with voters and really change the dynamics of this race.
I have to say, one of the things that surprises me all the time is that, given the scrutiny that goes on in a political campaign, if you say something that's incorrect, people are going to know about it, right? And so for Tim Walz to misspeak and embellish his record or say he was in China when he wasn't, and then kind of falter when asked about it. I mean, we saw that with Senator Blumenthal when he embellished his record in Vietnam. Who was it? Brian Williams, when the anchor, when he said he was in a helicopter and he was not. So why not just get out in front and just say, first of all, not say it at all. But I don't understand. Is there something with a military record, or it's just that they don't think that anyone's actually going to call them out or look into it?
I don't know, but I'm kind of old-fashioned, and to me it has something to do with pride and shame. Walt seemed genuinely embarrassed that he had misspoken, and his floundering response showed that. I think other candidates, I think especially Donald Trump, is frankly shameless. When he misspeaks, he doesn't apologize. He doesn't say, I got it wrong. He doesn't he doubles down and continues with it. And I think you saw an example of that in that debate, right? When Walz asked Vance if he thought Donald Trump won the 2020 election or lost it. And Vance wouldn't answer and made no bones about it and just changed the subject. So I think I think different people respond to making one misstatement very differently than just sort of saying whatever you want to say.
That's a very good point, because we're all human and we all make mistakes. And so your observation is that he honed up to it. He felt embarrassed by it, whereas the Vance and Trump campaign, they say things all the time that without any taking a second look at
I just think it was a very awkward sort of dog ate my homework sort of answer, and he should have just said, I screwed up, and then let's move on. Or I screwed up on one misstatement, and the other side says something else and change the subject. Or it was just very, I think he was caught off guard.
Yeah. I know that Kamala Harris wanted to have a second debate. I know that Donald Trump does not want that. Who would that benefit? Does he realize that? Or, I mean, why not have a second debate?
Because I think it won't help Trump, and it might help Harris. So I think Harris has a little more incentive to have another debate. But I don't see Donald Trump as benefiting from another debate. And, he's right. Because he's right about that. That this election is very much baked in. We are talking about a very small sliver of voters who haven't made up their mind in a few swing states. And so, why take a risk of another debate where Trump might not perform as well as he's capable of performing? Like most of us say about that last debate with Harris and Trump.
Yeah, I guess you could say quit while you're ahead, but I don't know who's ahead because it's very, very close.
Right now, I think it's leaning Trump's way. The polls are starting to tilt a little bit towards Trump. And we do know that from all of the other elections Trump has been in, that undecided voters tend to tilt towards Trump in the last week of the election. And I think Trump's campaign team is aware of that, and they want to let things play out as they are without introducing a wild card like what might happen at another debate.
Why do you think that is? I mean, Connecticut's largest voting bloc, right, are independents and undecided voters.
Yeah.
Why in those final hours, and I'm not sure that's in Connecticut as much as it is in other parts of the country, that they would lean more Republican? Why is that?
Right. Well, two reasons. It's not necessarily Republican. What we know is that people who take a long time to decide, like wait until the last week of the election, tend to say they're undecided, but they tend to vote for the challenger, for the candidate who's the change candidate. And so
hoping for something different.
And this has been the strategy of the Trump campaign, even when he's president. I'm the candidate of change. They're the candidate of the status quo. And so that's one factor. Another factor is something that's not talked a whole lot about is the quiet Trump voters, the people who don't really say on polls that they're thinking of voting for Donald Trump or they're leaning that way. And polls don't really capture that very well. The polls have always underestimated Donald Trump in every one of his elections by a couple percentage points.
Right.
And
I
he's
remember
expecting the same thing this year.
In the last election, and I'll give you an example. I was with the Democratic Party downtown Hartford, and I remember at the beginning of the night, people were excited, the atmosphere, the mood was good. And then when the numbers started to come in, it really kind of hit people, and at some point, no one would look up at the screen anymore because they saw that. So I think it came very surprisingly to them. They did not expect Donald Trump to do as well. Obviously most people by now have a pretty good idea of who they're going to vote for.
Yeah.
But there are quite a few people out there, I think, who don't want to vote for either one. How does that affect this election?
I think these are kind of the people we're talking about, these undecided voters who are still undecided, and more debates and more issue conflicts they're not really going to help them decide.
Not at all.
And they may just flip a coin in the end. Who knows how they will decide? But they're waiting for that one piece of information, that one slip up that might happen at the end that might tilt them. And this is why this election can be exhausting. It's like sort of a baseball game for the World Series, and we're into extra innings, and it's down to whoever's the last one to make a mistake is going to lose, and rather than the last one to make a good point or a good political move going to win. It's sort of a test of nerves and who can hold it together all the way to the end of this thing.
Do you think there'll be a significant number of people who won't vote?
That's the trends have been. It's funny as sick and tired as of many people say they are of politics and the election and the campaign. Our voting turnout is going up and up and up. Last election 4 years ago had the highest voter count of American history. We had really strong voter turnout, highest youth turnout in American history. So even younger voters who usually are the least, less likely to vote than older voters, they were turning out in record numbers. So I expect we'll have extraordinarily high turnout once again, maybe not a record, but that's what's likely to happen, especially in these swing states. There are hundreds of millions of dollars being pumped into those states to get out the vote and to get those undecided people, just to almost literally drag them out to the polls to get them to vote.
Let's talk about Connecticut.
Okay.
Right? Always known as this blue state. We have a trifecta. We have a Democratic governor, Democratic General Assembly. We have codified Roe v. Wade, which is a big issue in this campaign, right?
Yeah.
But Connecticut wasn't always as democratic, and a lot of people say, well, Connecticut doesn't really factor into the big picture because we're so predictable. They did change the primary this year to hopefully give us more significance, but I don't think that was really all that effective.
No.
And you've done quite a bit of this. You've recently written I'm not going to say an article, but
a book chapter
on this, and tell our viewers and listeners what you wrote it for and how you wrote about the evolution of Connecticut politics.
It was a chapter in a book called More Than Blue, More Than Yankee. It's out by University of Massachusetts Press just last week. So
Oh, great.
it's now out in bookstores and Amazon. And I wrote one chapter in there. I wrote the Connecticut chapter. There's a chapter on every state in New England. But it's true. Connecticut used to be a Republican-leaning state, and then it had a fairly long stretch as a swing state. Connecticut used to be the prototypical swing state up until about the 1960s, and then the Democrats became a bit stronger, and we saw sort of a back and forth. But I'm most interested in the fact that Connecticut now is considered one of the bluest of blue states. And how did that happen?
More so than California.
Well, yeah. Delaware and Hawaii are the states that have been, are the only states that have been in a blue trifecta longer than Connecticut. So Connecticut is a very democratic state. That doesn't mean there aren't lots of Republican bastions and places where Republicans are stronger. Of course, that's true in every state. But sort of on when you look at the General Assembly, it's almost a 2-to-1 advantage of Democrats in the House, and a veto-proof Senate for the Democrats. So and a Democratic governor. So how did we get there? And will it actually become a bigger majority in this coming election?
Right, because Chris Shays, who was the last Republican congressman, what was the year? It's been a while.
It's been a while.
Yeah, I'm very bad with numbers.
I'm bad with numbers too today, but it's
and I hear it all the time when I cover races, especially on not a statewide level, not as much in the House and Senate and the General Assembly, because certain districts, as you mentioned, but when it comes to Congress and Senate, people say, well, it's very hard for a Republican to win. They don't have a chance. And I think that's very discouraging for the Republican Party, because they may have a hard time finding really good, viable candidates to run. In fact, there are some who would argue this time around, maybe not, and they're just putting a placard in because they have to have a candidate.
And
so
there is that chance in the 5th District with Jahana Hayes and George Logan. That was a rematch from last time. It was a close election.
Very close,
Hayes
only
won.
2,000 votes, very close.
Logan is a terrific candidate for the Republicans, and he has the combination to make that a competitive race. But not a single New England Republican won a seat in the U.S. Congress in the last election. So it's all blue in the U.S. Congress and very strongly blue in our own state legislature. And I really argue in my chapter, in my research, was a lot of research to show this, that Connecticut became more suburbanized between 1970 and 2020. About 71% of our population lives in what could be called a suburb. And what we're finding with, looking back over the span of time that Quinnipiac has been doing polling in the state, we really do see that there's a stable margin of support for Democrats, even among independents in the suburbs. So what's happening in the suburbs? Why are these suburban independents leaning towards the Democrats and apparently leaning more and more? And it's basically because the suburbs have become more diverse. In the 1990s and 2000s, we saw higher educated people of color moving into suburban areas, especially the rings of suburbs right outside our urban areas. This is the same time we've seen more working women who live in the suburbs, and they tend to drift towards the Democrats. So it isn't a huge margin of people we're talking about, but as the suburbs have grown in population, that small margin of support for Democratic candidates among independents in the suburbs has actually translated into win after win after win until we have all of Connecticut's state government controlled by Democrats today.
You've highlighted so many important things to talk about, but I think, especially when it comes to women in the suburbs, and now with this huge issue with reproductive rights, it is very much a key issue in this campaign for a lot of women, and that's something that the Republicans have struggled with, certainly Trump and Vance, about flip-flopping on when should you have an abortion, who should have an abortion. And I think even those who may not necessarily support abortion feel that women should have that right. So that could be a key issue for a lot of women in Connecticut suburbs.
Yes, and I've noticed that the Democrats have really tried to frame that message as being about individual liberty, rather than feminism or some other approach that or choice. They haven't used that word choice so much as they have been using the word freedom, and I think that this has sort of helped them, for lack of a better word, market that position, especially among those sort of middle-of-the-road voters who maybe don't support abortion on demand, but they seem to like the restraint that some states have used with Roe v. Wade and sort of codifying that. But when you look at Connecticut, this has been part of the difficulty for Republicans in our state, is that as the ranks of the unaffiliated voters have swelled, Republican voter registration has sort of stayed constant at around like 24%, depending on the town. Both of these parties are very polarized on this, right. And so it's hard for Republicans to win that segment of voters with the party they have. They need more people in their party, and I don't have the answer, but that's the solution.
We have less than 2 minutes to go, and I want you to wrap it up with, can Kamala Harris get people in our urban areas to vote? I think Democrats have counted on people in the cities, and rightfully so, because they've propelled them to the victory in many elections. Will Kamala Harris be able to do that in Connecticut and other states to get more people engaged and vote for her?
I mean, I think that's likely to happen in Connecticut. I mean, it's going to be, the 5th district is a key turnout race. That turnout will mean everything. And Harris was supporting Johanna Hayes by coming into the state in the last election. I don't know if she'll come again, but that's one factor. But I think if you look at nationwide, the Democrats in those swing states really do have a serious on-the-ground organization that is intended to generate that vote. And it worked 4 years ago. I think you're likely to see it work again. Will it be enough to win? I guess we'll have to wait and find out in November.
Well, it's very important. There are some candidates. Michael Massey, who's running against John Larson, has pointed out, John Griffin, I'm sorry, he's running against him. But Michael Massey, who's running against DeLauro, feels that a lot of our inner cities are being neglected. So it's a huge issue in this campaign. But we want to thank you for joining us here on Real Talk. It's been a great time talking to you, and I hope you come back real soon and share some more insight. Thank you for listening, everybody. We'll be back next week.
Mm-hmm.